Giant Gavin is a slug, but Gavin is no ordinary slug. He is a giant and he loves adventures. Giant Gavin's adventure today is to find himself the perfect home. Giant Gavin bumps into his good friend Theodore the dog. He tells Theodore all about his giant adventure to find a home. Theodore the dog tells Giant Gavin that he can live with him in his doghouse. But Theodore's doghouse was far too smelly for Giant Gavin the slug. So Giant Gavin the slug keeps on slithering and continues his giant adventure to find a home. Giant Gavin notices his friend Mr. and Mrs. Beaver playing by the stream. He tells Mr. and Mrs. Beaver all about his giant adventure to find a home. Mr. and Mrs. Beaver tell Giant Gavin that he is more than welcome to live with them in their dam. But Mr. and Mrs. Beaver's dam was very wet and the dripping water kept Giant Gavin awake all night. So Giant Gavin the slug keeps on slithering and continues his giant adventure to find a home. Giant Gavin the slug notices Susie the bunny playing upside down in her burrows. Giant Gavin tells Susie the bunny all about his giant adventure to find a home. Susie invites Giant Gavin to live with her in her burrows. But Susie the bunny's burrows were too small and tight for Giant Gavin the slug. So Giant Gavin the slug keeps on slithering and continues his giant adventure to find a home. Giant Gavin the slug hears a voice yell out to him. It's his good friend Sarah the bird. Giant Gavin tells Sarah the bird all about his giant adventure to find a home. Sarah the bird tells Giant Gavin he can live with her in her big tree. But Sarah the bird's tree was far too big and high for Giant Gavin. It was so high that Giant Gavin didn't even want to look down. So Giant Gavin the slug keeps on slithering and continues his giant adventure to find a home. Giant Gavin the slug was tired from slithering all day. He was beginning to believe that he would never find a home. His giant adventure was not fun anymore, so Giant Gavin the slug curled up and cried. Giant Gavin the slug was disturbed by the most amazing thing he'd ever seen before. A caravan went zooming past. Now Giant Gavin has a great idea, so he carries on his giant adventure to find a home. Giant Gavin the slug slithers his way to a nearby caravan sales yard. And then it happened. Giant Gavin the slug spots the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Hidden away in the back, pushed aside from all the other caravans, he found this little funny-shaped wheelless caravan. And he got it. Giant Gavin the slug had finished his adventure. In doing so, he found something very interesting. Giant Gavin the slug was not a slug anymore. He was Gavin the giant snail. Gavin the giant snail loves adventures, and now he has a home that he can take along with him everywhere he slithers.